Welcome to Codicology 2.2. This is the second part of the stages of manuscript production unit where we're going to talk about binding and book covers. So where we left off in the last, or what we covered in the last lecture, was the creation of the basic page of the manuscript. And we were talking at the very beginning of lecture 2.1 about how once the parchment sheet was dried under tension and then cut away from the hearse, you could then cut it down into roughly rectangular shaped sheets that would then be folded to create bifolia, or then folded even further to create smaller units that you could then nest together to create what's called a choir or a gathering. In this case, this picture, what we're looking at here, we have 5 bifolia all nested together to form what would be called a quinion, or a choir of 5 sheets forming 10 leaves. So 5 bifolia sheets forming 10 leaves or 20 pages of text. A choir like this, or a gathering like this, those words are interchangeable, forms the basic constituent of any bound manuscript. And you can assemble these choirs in any number that you really want, as long as you can create a bound structure that is manageable and usable and that doesn't destroy itself in the process of being used. We're going to talk a little bit about how these books, these codices, were structured. So also in the last lecture, I covered how the scribe would often leave written instructions or little written prompts for the rubricator and maybe even the illuminator, indicating how they should add their own work to the manuscript. Well, they did the same thing for binders. We'll take a look at the 2 main ways that scribes left information for binders. First is by providing what are called catchwords at the bottom of the page. So if you think back, we'll move back to this quinion for a minute. So on the far left of this image, you have what's called the exterior or the external bifolium of the choir. We're looking at the front of that bifolium, but on the verso of the second sheet, or the second folio of that bifolium, that's where the text for this choir unit would have ended. And very often what you can see in manuscripts is that the scribe will have added what's called a catchword. In this case, you can see it at the bottom right corner. And what a catchword is it is the first word of the next page of text on the first page of the next choir in the manuscript that should appear. So in this case, we have written at the bottom of the last folio of the previous choir, the word predicationem. And if you go to the top of the right page, you'll see that same word with characteristic abbreviation marks spelled out there, predicationem. So this is a symbol that, as the scribal work is finished and you have these individual choirs, should there be any mishap and those choirs get mixed up, the binder always has recourse, or usually should have recourse, to go to these catchwords in order to help him or her figure out the exact order in which the choirs would fit. Another tool that they would use, because if it's not bound, the choirs themselves might get mixed up. The scribe might put in choir marks, in which case what they're doing is numbering or lettering the choir. And what we see here is choir E, representing the 5th choir that is supposed to be in this bound codex. And then the leaf number. So we have an E1 in an Arabic numeral and an E2 in an Arabic numeral. So if those 2 bifolia got mixed up somehow, the binder would be able to know how to throw those back in order, and then in conjunction with the catchword, know how to fit it all in together. So it's really quite a handy little process of collaboration that you see going from the scribal workshop to the binding workshop, which during the medieval period were very often entirely unrelated enterprises. So when we're thinking about binding, very often what most of us consider as a binding first in our minds visually are the covers of the book. I want to state very clearly at the beginning of this that binding is not the covers. The covers form part of the overall structure of the binding, but the binding, as we'll see in a few slides, is specifically about how the book is sewn together. What I want to focus on first are covers. So the covers of the book, or of the manuscript, principally are there to provide a little bit of an anchor for the binding supports, but they're also there to protect the text block of the actual codex. And there are 4 or 5, as you see here, listed in 4, but technically 5 predominant ways that books would have been covered. You've got no cover or a simple wrapper. you have limp or semi-limp vellum covers, you have a pasteboard or cartonnage cover, and then you have simply boards. And I'm going to stop the PowerPoint share here for a minute so that I can point out what these look like with OSU manuscripts. So in this case, what we're looking at here are individual quires, or in this case, a pair of quires that have been bound together but without formal covers. So in this case, what we have is essentially a no cover manuscript where the first page of text actually serves as the exterior cover. The last page of text is a nice blank cover, but it preserves writing on the inside of that. Similarly to that, we have a document where we have an external cover, and this is added kind of identifying text. It's not so much a title as just an indication of what's here, kind of a very abbreviated description of the overall contents of this manuscript. And the back is a blank cover, but then they've used the first and last pages, the insides of the front and rear covers to begin the text. So here we have these kind of self-enclosed covers. What we would call these in modern bibliographical terms, if we were thinking about 19th and 20th century printing, these are what we would call self-wrappers. So self-wrapper manuscripts. We then have limp or semi-limp vellum covered manuscripts. And in this case, we have something from this early 16th century, but it's bound in a 12th century recycled manuscript leaf. And a limp or semi-limp bound manuscript or covered manuscript, all it is a piece of parchment. So a limp vellum manuscript is a piece of parchment that encloses the text block and all of the quires. A semi-limp cover would be basically the same thing, but possibly reinforced with another piece of parchment or maybe a piece of paper if you're getting later on in the period. So really, really cheap. Absolutely the cheapest type. Next step up in expense would be a recycled or just kind of an imperfect piece of parchment to create the equivalent of, say, a modern paperback cover. After that, we then have pasteboard or cartonnage covers. And here, from the outside, this late 14th century manuscripts, it might look like it's pretty formally bound, say in a board cover, which we'll get to in a second. But actually, this is made out of pasteboard. Pasteboard was a slightly more expensive and durable way of covering your manuscripts. But keeping that illusion of durability and more expense and deluxe qualities, but made out of very cheap products. And so I'm not really going to do this too much here because this is a very fragile manuscript, but what you're seeing here are not pages. These are all individual pieces of parchment, in this case, unfinished sheepskin. I'll have this out for our in-person session during this week so that you can take a look. But if you look inside the folds, you can actually see sheep's wool. So they would have taken imperfect parchment or unfinished parchment, and binding workshops would have bought such things and then used them to create these mock board bindings where you're getting a little bit more sturdiness, but with a lot less expense. And then finally, we have board bindings, and they're called board bindings for a very simple reason. It's because they're made out of wood. In this case, this is birch wood. Very, very durable, extremely expensive compared to all of the other formats of cover that we're talking about. These are your four principal methods, or five if you're talking about the no cover option, methods of covering manuscripts. So let me get back to our slideshow here. So, moving on from covers to the actual binding structure themselves, there are all sorts of different kind of historical styles of book binding that can roughly be divided into four major periods or four movements. Here I want to again stress that binding equates to the structure that holds the manuscript together, giving it structural strength and flexibility, holds everything together but makes it usable at the same time. This is not to be confused with covers, which principally equal protection. The periods or the styles of binding, I will also want to stress that, say for instance, Coptic binding, I've got it listed here as stretching from the 3rd through the 7th, early 8th centuries. Just because I have those dates, it does not mean that components of Coptic binding, for instance, were not used in later periods. So I'm not going to leave the share, but in the manuscript I'm holding here, the semi-limp covered manuscript, This one, for instance, I said is early 16th century, but it's bound in a Coptic style, and we'll learn more about that binding in a second. So all of these different periods of binding can actually overlap in the manuscripts that you're looking at, and it's important to be able to recognize some of the key constituent features of each period when you're interpreting how a book was put together, how much it might have cost, and the different artistic styles and crafts styles that are embodied in that manuscript and its binding. So the 4 periods that we're talking about are Coptic binding, stretching roughly from the 3rd to the early 8th century, Carolingian binding, which goes from the early 8th into the 11th centuries, Romanesque binding, late 11th, early 12th century on through the 13th, and then Gothic binding, which kind of finishes the evolution of medieval binding techniques and begins roughly in the 14th century and carries on into the 18th century. I want to stress again that all of these periods, all of these styles persist to this day. When we're talking about Coptic binding, there are a few different styles. Coptic binding is really the earliest known period of binding. It starts in northern Egypt, or northern Africa, excuse me, principally Egypt. And you really see this kind of quick progression in the way that binding is developing. The very earliest Coptic bindings are what are called stab-stitched bindings. And this is a really, really basic way of doing things. So essentially, and again, I'm not going to leave the share, but if you have individual quires and you stack them, what you're doing is punching through the margin of the page, and you're just shoving cord or thread, some sort of cloth thread through there, and you're sewing those pages together. But it's not in the fold, it's in the margin of the manuscript. There's a strength to this in that it is really, really cheap and easy to make. The weaknesses for this, however, is that it's often irregular in terms of the quire structures that compose it. So during the Coptic period, you might see a quire that consists of 10 bifolia, but you could equally have commonly have a quire that would be 20, 30, or 40 bifolia, all then stabbed through with a single thread that kind of binds it together and ties it together. When you have larger quires like this, what you wind up getting when you fold them and then stab stitch them is irregular placement of the text blocks. So the outer pages are going to wind up having much wider text blocks than inner pages because the available surface space, as you get further into these very thick quires, the available surface space on each page decreases. So you're going to have often irregular quire structures that are too large. This results in inconsistent page layouts and placement. The other thing, when you're stabbing straight through the actual margin of the manuscript, what happens when you turn the page is that you're not getting a clean opening, and that binding is going to abrade against the parchment or the papyrus surface, or indeed later the paper surface that you're using. And the thread or the leather thong that's going through that margin is going to wear away and ultimately tear apart the manuscript pages that you're trying to turn. So this eventually destroys the entire consistency and coherence of the binding. Very quickly, the Copts realized that there were better ways to bind their books. And we start with in the fold sewing, which is a really nice way to support multi-quire structures. You have to create fairly regularly sized quire structures here, usually anywhere from, say, 3 bifolia to 6 to 10 bifolia at the most. And there are 2 principal varieties of in the fold sewing. First, we have long sewing, and this is where the central fold of the bifolium, if say you've got a bifolium of 5, or excuse me, a quire of 5 bifolia, you open up to that 5th bifolium, and that center fold you're going to sew through, and that's going to be sewn directly to the outer cover of the manuscript and then looped down to the next quire. And you can see this happening here in the illustration that I've got. It's also called stationary binding or tacket binding. Now, this is nice because it really directly ties the text block and the quires into the covers that are protecting it, but it doesn't provide a very stable binding structure. And indeed, when you come into rare books and manuscripts and you're able to kind of feel some of these manuscripts for yourselves, you'll be able to tell that there's a lot of wiggling that goes on when you turn the pages of the manuscript with a stationary or long sewing binding. The second type is a link or a chain stitched binding. This provides a lot more stability. This is a continuous long form of sewing that goes through the fold. And what happens here is that every time you pass through the quire and the fold, you wind up lacing the end of your loop through the stitch that proceeds from the quire immediately preceding the quire you're working on. So if you follow the string in the illustration on the bottom right, if you go to the very bottom right corner, find the end of the string and just follow it with your finger through the binding. I'd love to be able to be teaching in person with this because it's a lot easier to illustrate, but just follow on your screen with your finger that thread as it loops through and hits in a chain fashion each successive quire above it. So what this does is it creates a pretty strong binding structure, but over time, as you manipulate this, it winds up warping the spine. And the board attachment is very often weak because usually in bindings like this, you're going to typically find them covered with wooden boards. And what you can see as a problem is immediately manifest in this image. So the binding, the cords are attached through essentially what would be a stab stitch hole, the equivalent of that. You can see the hole in the wooden board going through the margin as opposed to through the edge. So as you loop that thread, the sewing thread, over and through that hole, you wind up creating a tension point that as you open the cover and you start flexing the book as you're using it, it's going to wear away. The edge of that board is going to wear away at that thread, and ultimately it's going to split that thread. Once that thread is split, you've effectively broken that chain and your manuscript is going to start coming apart. So it's relatively weak form of binding for the long-term use of manuscripts, while at the same time it at least provides a little bit more of a stable structure than sewing, long sewing or stab stitching. When we get to Carolingian binding in the 8th through the 11th century, the big thing that happens here is the introduction of supported sewing. So it kind of reproduces in some ways the idea of what chain link stitching is, but it does so by incorporating cord or leather supports that the thread, as you work it through each quire, the centerfold of each quire, you're going to loop that thread around the support. So if we look at the image on the top left, you're going to see these double cord supports, and the red and blue binding thread goes through and does a figure 8 around each of the double cord sewing supports. What this winds up doing, in contrast to chain link stitching, the supported sewing provides essentially the girders for a very sound structure for your manuscript binding. It's going to allow for flexibility, but it distributes the tension much more evenly as you're manipulating the book, and it just really helps everything hold together. This was the major development of the Carolingian period. The other thing that the Carolingian style of binding does that is new is, remember I just talked about the weakness of the hole in chain stitch binding when you get into the covers, going through the margin of the binding. What Carolingian binding does is it develops the lacing in of covers. So those supports, whether they're leather supports, or thread or cord supports of some sort, those are actually laced into board covers by tunneling into the thickness of the board. And you can see this in the bottom right image, where this leather support has been channeled into the actual wooden boards. You would create a tunnel in the board, and then on the inside of each cover, you would then carve down until that leather was exposed. The leather or the cords were exposed, and then you would glue or pin those in place. What this winds up doing is turning the covers into an integral component of the actual binding structure themselves. The binding and the covers effectively become one unit. The next period of binding is the Romanesque binding period, and this is from the 12th to the 13th centuries. A couple big innovations here. The first is the introduction of the sewing frame, and that's the image at the top center of this slide. And this you can see in action here, where you've got a wooden frame from which you're able to suspend all of these sewing supports, these, in this case, double cord sewing supports. This allows you to just build off of the Carolingian innovation by creating a much more rigid and structured approach to the sewing process itself, allowing you to create more regular bindings and more precise sewing ties. Another development that happened during this period is the increasing use of what are called slit whittawed thong supports. So basically, whittawing is a process of finishing leather, makes it extremely durable. You can recognize whittawed leather essentially by its color. It's usually very pale to white. So the use of whittawed thong sewing supports, where the thread that's going through the centerfold is then looped around the leather. This is an extremely durable support. And then another thing it does, and the Romanesque period does, and you can see this in the bottom center image, is the addition of spine linings. So what they do here is it might be blank parchment, it could be cloth. In this case, what we have is an obsolete manuscript that's been cut apart and cut into smaller pieces and then pasted across the width of the text block. So what you can see in this image, you see the sewing supports with the threads wrapped around it, but in order to afford the binding and the book a little bit more stability and long-term stability, is they've pasted these parchment strips across the block of quires between the sewing supports in order to just provide it with a little bit more support. The last period is the Gothic binding period, and this is 13th to the 18th centuries. Big thing that happens here is the introduction of the use of animal glue in spine linings. So in addition to, sometimes instead of using spine liners that they used in the Romanesque period, they might just slather the entire back of that spine with glue in order to help hold the individual quires together. Very often they were also adding spine liners in on top of this though. Another feature is that the number of sewing supports that are added to the books, the number of individual sewing stations is much more consistently directly related to the actual size of the book. In the Carolingian and the Romanesque periods, a lot of times you might see what seems to be too few sewing supports or way too many sewing supports, binding overkill for a book. In the Gothic period, you tend to see a lot more proportionality between how many sewing support stations you have and the overall size of the book. One of the reasons for this may be because we're seeing more books being produced, and this is a much more efficient way. Why put on more binding supports and spend more time binding a book than you actually have to? Another thing that they do is using beveled edges on boards. And essentially what a beveled edge is when the sharp right angle edge of a board is smoothed down into a curve or into a gentle slope. They can do this on the fore edge of the book or the outside edge of the book that opens up. And one of the things that does is it facilitates carrying the book with the fore edge down in your hand. But they're typically in Gothic binding, they're beveling the boards at the spine side. And this is for the really big change that happens between Gothic binding and the periods that happened before it, which is that tunnel in, lacing in approach that the Carolingians developed is subtly changed in the Gothic period, where it goes from the tunnel to what's called the over and in approach. So rather than tunneling into the actual board, they've beveled it down, and the sewing supports are gently laced in and gradually laced into the cover, where you then channel them through the board and then peg them or glue them in place. Now, the big thing that this changes is that it results in a rounded spine on Gothic books, whereas the tunnel-in approach in Carolingian and Romanesque books results in a flat spine. So this is another one of those telltale signs in manuscripts that you can kind of quickly glance at a manuscript and get a sense of when it may have been bound or what style it was bound in based on the shape of the spine. Finally, with bindings, we have what are called finishing elements. And the finishing elements are the actual covers themselves, not the wood and that kind of thing, but if you've got, say, wooden boards, the leather or the cloth that are put on over that to help protect that wood, but also to make them more decorative and more appealing. Very often that leather can be tooled. And what that means is you've got blind tooling or gold or gilt tooling. And tooling is the decorative marks that you see incised in leather bindings. So in this large image on the right, all of those black patterns are blind tooled patterns where the leather, after it's been glued to the cover, has been moistened, and decorative metal tools have been marginally heated and then pressed into the cover of the book to create these designs. This was definitely something that was a decorative element that was added to manuscripts and early book bindings. but it could also be something that would prove to be functional. A lot of times you could have a book's inventory or catalog number for a particular, say, monastic or institutional library tooled in. Sometimes names of saints as decorative elements might be tooled in. For our purposes, what can be really interesting and helpful with the tooled patterns on bindings is that we can use these to really help us localize where a binding may have been put on. And in the case of the image that we're looking at on the right, if you look at the very central panel of this binding and you see these kind of upside down teardrop shaped things in, say, the top right corner of that central quadrant, that upside down teardrop shape is very, very characteristically German and is often associated with binding workshops operating out of the cities of Ulm and Augsburg. So I can't swear that this is where this binding is from. I haven't actually worked on this, I think this is a manuscript. This might be a 15th century printed book. I haven't worked too much on this, so I can't be precisely certain, but it is definitely a German binding. In addition to blind and gilt tooling, we also have what's called furniture, and furniture consists of all of these metal bits and bobs that are added to book cover. These also can be very, very decorative, but they're also extremely functional. So first and foremost, we have clasps, and you can see in the large image on the right, at the very right edge of the book binding, or the covers, I should say, you have clasp catch stations. Clasps were important because they kept a book closed. Now, why do you think this might have been? If you keep the book closed in a tight text block, this makes the entire structure of the book a little bit more resistant to the depredations of, say, a mouse or a rat that wants to eat into the fabric of the book. You've got essentially a brick of parchment or paper as opposed to something that is potentially a rather loose binding where a creature, insects, rats otherwise, could kind of burrow in. More importantly, though, and more immediately, what clasps do is they keep the covers closed and prevent the book from expanding and contracting in response to latent humidity and other types of kind of weather circumstances and weather conditions that might be in a library. Without a clasp on a book, you can imagine that as the seasons change and the relative humidity grows greater, the parchment or the paper in that manuscript is going to soak up that atmospheric moisture, and the paper parchment is going to expand. As it expands, the binding in turn is going to expand, and you wind up having a book breathing during the course of the year. That expansion and contraction over the course of years is ultimately going to wind up breaking the book. So clasps help stall that process. If you look at the image on the bottom left here, you're going to see right in the center, you're going to see what's called a boss or a stud. And at the corners, you're going to see what are called edge or corner shoes. These are metal devices that are added to the book. They're often very decorative, but in this case, what they principally do is they protect the covers of the book and the leather in this case from being abraded as you lay it open on a lectern or on a desk. Oftentimes in the Middle Ages, books were stored by being laid flat on top of each other, and these bosses would help keep those books separate and help keep the bindings and their covers from rubbing up and abrading each other. The edge and corner shoes, similarly, as you're manipulating that book, and if you're going to store them on their spines or on their ends, that helps prevent wear and tear on the corners. And finally, you may encounter, unfortunately, we don't have any of these in OSU's own collection, but you may encounter actual chains or the remains of stations where chains were attached to books. And when you have a chained manuscript, essentially what you're looking at is a manuscript from a controlled library. It's a security system where the chain would have run from a little clasp lock area on the book cover itself, down the chain to another ring that would have been attached to a long metal bar that would have run the length of a desk or a lectern at which you would have sat and used the book. And that, of course, that chain prevents you from running off with the book. So that's basic finishing techniques and finishing characteristics for bindings and for bound manuscripts. What I'm going to leave you with here, and you can't click through on the lecture, but we will post these PowerPoints on Carmen site, so you can go through and download that and access the links directly through there. But this is a little video of how sewing frame supported binding actually looks, what that process looks like. And if I recall correctly, this is a video out of Italy, and you don't have to watch the whole thing, but watch the first minute or so of it, first minute or two of it, just to get a sense of how this sewing process works, from puncturing through the fold and then doing figure eights and wrapping the thread and threading that needle around those sewing supports, those double cord sewing supports. Okay, this concludes our Codicology 2.2 lecture. You're going to have an opportunity in your in-person session to work with both fragments and bound codices. So please make sure that you review the different binding styles, because we'll be asking you to identify, to the best of your abilities, the signs you're seeing in the binding styles of our own manuscripts to tell us whether it's Coptic, Gothic, Romanesque, Carolingian, or maybe something else entirely. Okay, thank you very much.